And welcome back to the final segment of our show this morning, where we will be discussing World Population Day 2017. As such, we have been joined by another panel of three. We have with us Miss Augustina Elijo. She is a Deputy Director at the Health Service. We also have Mackeva Westby, She's the Program Coordinator out of the Special Envoy for Women and Children. And of course, our good friend Tisa Grant, the Liaison Officer with UN Population Fund. Good morning, ladies. Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, good morning. So Tisa, before we just jump into the conversation, tell us, what is World Population Day?
Yes, so World Population Day was first marked in 1989, where there was a day observed, the day of 5 billion, where we looked at the population and its growth. And so there was a recommendation made to have that day marked as World Population Day thereafter to bring awareness and focus to population issues. So ever since July 11th, 1990, that's when World Population Day has been celebrated. Now, following that, there is the International Conference on Population and Development, which took place in 1994. And what that did was mark a paradigm shift to the way we look at population issues. It basically went from a demographic approach to a rights-based approach. So it looked at having family planning, or have people be a part of their family planning and decisions that affect them. So instead of having persons be recipient of services, they were actually part and parcel of their own personal development. And so this is how World Population Day came about. The focus is basically making investments in well, let me back up a little bit. The centerpiece of all of this is the having universal access to sexual and reproductive health services, which includes family planning services. And so this year, the theme for World Population Day is I'm drawing a blank. Family planning, empowering people and developing nations. Yes. So that's the theme for this year.
And can you chime in, Mrs. Elijo, on how the Health Services Department is helping to celebrate and push this theme?
Definitely, the Ministry of Health is a big stakeholder in this stake. When we look at family planning in the broad perspective, we do play an integral part. There is the family and community unit of the Ministry of Health that focuses on this. So it looks at family from different angles. It also looks at age ranges. And as it relates to the theme today with adolescents, there is a great part that the ministry is playing. We look at adolescent, and we are looking mainly at the age 15 to 19, where these adolescents need to know what is sexual and reproductive health. They also need to know what is family planning. They need to know when is consent, when families are involved, what rules, what regulations apply to them. And as a result of all that, the ministry do have policies, it do have planning, and it also had other overpinning, if I would say, like the CARICOM framework. We have the COMISCA framework, we got the National Health Agenda, and all in effort to look at, again, the sustainable developmental goals that we are aspiring to reach in 2030, and as well the whole aspect of the coverage for this age group. So we focus on all those areas. And so as it relates to sexual and reproductive health, that is done at the community level, where we have our community health workers working with adolescents it is also done in urban areas where we would also have our rural health as well as public health nurses. And we work in tandem with schools with health education for these young people.
And Mackeva, tell us about the importance of the partnerships through the Office of the Special Envoy.
Yes, absolutely. Well, first of all, I'd like to extend apologies on behalf of Mrs. Barr for not being here today. She was committed to the event, but she had some personal matters that she had to attend to, so let me just say that. And for us, it's really about safeguarding the rights of women and girls, children, girls especially. From the statistics that we've seen, we note that adolescent pregnancy further perpetuates the cycle of poverty, violence, all these social ills that affect our children, and children born to adolescent parents are oftentimes more vulnerable. So it's really for us as duty bearers to take up that stand, to have that conversation, to keep youths involved as well for the decisions that we're trying to make for them and their welfare.
Definitely. So out of the Office of the UN Population Fund, Tisa, tell us how Belize plans to really celebrate World Population Day this year.
Okay, tomorrow we're having an forum with our stakeholders, but primarily including young people, because oftentimes we have interventions, frameworks, all sorts of activities, and we don't include the actual beneficiaries of those things. So the forum tomorrow is going to basically have an overview of what the family planning situation is in Belize, but primarily universal access to sexual and reproductive health from that youth perspective. We're looking at what is the current situation with young people in our country. We do have a very high rate of adolescent pregnancy, one of the highest in the Caribbean, one of the highest in the entire world. The last mix, 2015, has the numbers at 74 per thousand population, and this is actually an increase from the last mix of 2011, which had it at 64. So we're seeing what appears to be an increase. So we're going to have a discussion with the young people, and around the same CARICOM framework that Mrs. Elijo spoke about. This is the CARICOM framework for the integrated strategic framework for the reduction of adolescent pregnancy. And that has several goals that are to be met by 2019. We're in 2017. So, and since we are seeing an increase based on the mix survey, that there isn't much of a progress being made towards the reduction of adolescent pregnancy. So the conversation tomorrow would be with stakeholders on how they may support young people in achieving these objectives, but as well as speaking with young people themselves. What can they do as individuals? What can they do as youth networks to support themselves and to contribute towards the reduction of adolescent pregnancy?
There's what I find interesting is that when you look at the results of the multiple indicator cluster survey, and the fact that, say for instance, that particular area seemingly remains stagnant since it was last conducted, is it that the idea of adolescent pregnancy and trying to break this cycle has to do with first addressing the existing culture of sexuality among young people?
Right. Yes. There are so many factors that contribute to that, and we recognize that yes, there is that cultural aspect of it, but there is the aspect that necessary investments need to be made in young people. We have to look at the fact that when you're thinking about overall economic development, we cannot exclude the need for access to sexual and reproductive health services. We have to acknowledge the fact that when a person is able to decide freely and responsibly the number and the spacing of their children, or whether they have children, how that helps a person to then become more productive, to have certain educational achievements, to then be able to earn a higher income. And what we find is that with the necessary investments made, so it's not just only about health investments, it's also about education, you know, all sorts of opportunities that will allow a young person to achieve their full potential. So what we're thinking is that it needs, like most other social ills, it needs a multi-sectoral approach, and which is the case. I mean, the government has shown its commitment in that regard in several ways. So it goes beyond culture, but culture is one aspect of it. Behavior, behavior change needs to happen.
From the perspective of the ministry, I know that right now we have the BFLA, but in terms of family planning and the clinics themselves having a unit within it, what are the strides being made to ensure that within each community, across the city and across the country, that people do have access to this information?
I must say that special emphasis is being made to target adolescents. In the past, you would have looked at the maternal and child health clinics, as we would call them, but today it is now called the family and community, where like males, adolescents are being focused on. It is also the purview of the ministry to ensure that adolescents are being targeted regardless of where you're at. If you're in school, if you're not in school, if you're in very rural areas, you need to be accessed. And there are quite a number of forums that these students could attend. You have parents being involved too, so that they too can be knowledgeable and could make a difference for these children. It is a given that, why I say you need to involve parents, that parents are usually the first to teach their children. And there are quite a number of times that parents don't have the facts. So what they do tell the adolescent is not relevant, or there is some misconception there. So that need to be cleared up.
Correct.
At the clinics, there is also the importance of labeling from outside that we do have services for those type of persons. So it is being taken from different prongs, at schools, the community, at home, you know, and sessions even for these adolescents themselves.
Your input, Mackeva?
Yes, and to stem from that, we have noticed that, well, Antisa mentioned it, Belize has one of the highest rates of adolescent pregnancy in the Caribbean. So another initiative that Mrs. Barrow spearheaded too was the creation of a CARICOM First Ladies Network of Spouses. Back in 2015, a roundtable session which was supported by UNFPA local and regionally was held here in Belize. And from that, we learned from the different First Ladies from the Caribbean what has been done, what are some of the best practices, what are the challenges that we still face as a region. And from that as well was the creation of the Every Caribbean Woman, Every Caribbean Child initiative, which stems from the Ban Ki-moon's Every Woman, Every Child, which covers along 4 major priorities. Chief among them, of course, is adolescent pregnancy. We have some very interesting developments in the pipelines stemming from the Every Caribbean Woman, Every Caribbean Child. I won't delve into that today, but I do want to highlight that although the public may not see the work, we want to underscore that work is being done, you know.
And one of the things I would want us to emphasize today is the relationship between access to universal sexual and reproductive health services and women's empowerment and gender equality, and how all of that plays into the achievement of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So, I mean, we have under Goal 3 a specific target, I think target 3.7, that looks at achieving universal access to sexual and reproductive health services. So if we're talking about leaving no one behind, which is what the Sustainable Development Goal promises, then we must look at all these areas and acknowledge that family planning plays an integral part in development, or universal access to sexual and reproductive health services in general plays an important part to that.
How do you keep people accountable though? Because especially when it comes to a country like ours, where we have multiple ethnicities, different cultural beliefs, different practices, how do you ensure that the message it translates to every community?
That's really one of our challenges, I think, not only culturally, but when we look at church, state, all these are different beliefs and different decorum. You want to?
Yeah, it also includes primarily ensuring that everybody has access to comprehensive sexuality education, especially for our young people, and information that is age appropriate, culturally appropriate, but it has to be comprehensive. And we know that currently young people, based on which school they're going to, which district they live in, all of that kind of determines the degree of comprehensive sexuality education that you might receive. And I know that this is one of those topics that are, it's a bit controversial, but we cannot deny the fact that it's necessary. If a person is going to be able to make responsible, sound decisions, then they need to be given the information necessary.
Correct.
In terms of the ministry, how are the different departments partnering to ensure that happens? Because I'm thinking in a small primary school in Toledo or on Corozal, and you want to ensure that message is translated, not in terms of speech, but in terms of grasping
the information,
the concept of it and the importance of it, and providing the infrastructure, the resources in terms of teachers and getting the information there. How is the ministry helping to push that?
Okay, I must indicate that in every district, you do have a district team that ensures that happens. And the district team would work directly with the schools, with the community. If it's a culture issue, to involve persons from different cultures so that you could have the buy-in, and at the ending of the day, everybody would be on the one page and you move the agenda forward. Like you mentioned, the whole idea of the rights of the person, this whole aspect being right-based, and where the accountability lies. We must be mindful that for your right, the patient right, going like hand and glove is the accountability. It's not a one angle thing. It has to go together. You have this right, you need to be accountable for such thing. And that is the idea that is being sold. And with that, indeed, we could move.
I'm glad you mentioned the relationship between having the right and being held accountable for it, because oftentimes we only hear about people demanding having rights to certain things, for instance, but what do they do with the right? You don't really hear that much emphasis on holding them responsible and accountable for the manner in which they go about accessing and using the rights that are given to them. So the idea that there is sort of a mutual coexistence between being given the right and being able to use it properly and be held accountable for it, I think is something that is commendable fundamentally.
That is exactly correct. But in spite of the results of this rights-based approach, we still have many across the globe, women and girls who do not have a say Yes, we have quite a few of us who are able to enjoy the right of having access to family planning services, etc. But a lot of women don't, simply on account of being female. And so immediately they don't have that final say in whether or not they can access these services, whether or not they can have children. So what might appear to us as a person not being responsible with their right could very well be somebody who is in a position to not claim that right. So we need to see how we can work towards supporting each and every person, male and females, in exercising their right to decide how, when, how many children, you know, when they're going to have a family, and how they're going to space that family.
And I'm sure that's going to be on the agenda for the Growing the Future summer camp that's coming up this year. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Growing the Future summer camp? I'm not familiar.
No, that is something different. I'm sorry.
All right.
Oh yeah, no, not familiar.
So tell us about the other initiatives coming out of World Population Day.
Well, one of the things we want to highlight as well is family planning in humanitarian crisis.
Okay.
Because oftentimes we do not tend to see the linkage between the two. When humanitarian crisis happens, we find that there is an increase in violence, sexual violence. There is an increase in commercial sex or behavioral sex, or there are different types of escalation in behavior. And so we find that it's important to have family planning services available during a humanitarian crisis, whether that means access to condoms, whether that means access to contraceptives. It's very important because it is at that time important to avoid unintended pregnancies. Unintended pregnancies sometimes can lead to maternal death, maternal morbidity, different types of debilitating disease because you were not able to adequately space a pregnancy. So that's one of the things that we want to highlight. And during this year, we are going to be working with our partners in providing a training course that looks at including what is called the minimum initial service package. It's a minimum list of things to be done when in humanitarian crisis, so that this aspect of it is given attention to. The family planning is given attention during crisis. It's not just about food, you know, and shelter. We have to stop looking at sexual and reproductive health as something by itself. That is an integral part of development. We cannot escape it.
Definitely. And Mackeva, you want to tell us about how the Office of the Special Envoy is helping to support these initiatives?
Well, as I mentioned, UNFPA and our office has a very robust relationship. We often have dialogue as duty bearers on how we could combat some of the issues that our young girls are facing, and boys too. We oftentimes forget boys and leave them out. So that new approach is to include boys and to see how we could target them. And what we have discovered really is that when we look at low-lying fruits, we look at the comprehensive sexual and reproduction health studies. That in itself would definitely equip persons, boys and girls, to make that informed decision. So we're definitely on that trend, and as I mentioned with the Every Caribbean Woman, Every Caribbean Child initiative, that has some very interesting things in the pipeline, and we want that in itself would help to combat some of these issues and challenges.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about the forum that's happening tomorrow. Who is it open to, where it's going to be held, and other things?
Okay, it's going to be at the Radisson Fort George Hotel. We have on our list of invited guests, stakeholders, NGOs, government, and like I said, primarily young people. So they will make up at least half or more than half of those in attendance, because we want to hear from them. They are the ones being affected. As mentioned before, while the entire theme for World Population Day looks at family planning in general for development, we are zeroing in on our young people because of the situation that we find ourselves in and that they find themselves in. In terms of participation, we do welcome. I mean, seating might not be available since we have a number of guests expected, but if there are stakeholders who are interested in hearing about this topic further, then we would want to welcome them to pop in.
And the event starts at 9 a.m.
9 a.m.
So we're looking at 9 to 11 a.m. Tomorrow morning.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, ladies, for coming
Thank
on our
you.
couch and telling us all about what you have in store for tomorrow. And we wish you all the best in endeavors. I know that this is a very timely topic, and of course it aligns with the SDGs for 2030. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you
And
for
thank you
having
for having us.
Oh,
Thank you for
definitely.
having us.
We are going to take a really quick break, and when we come back, it's to have our wrap up. So stay tuned.